A man stood silent in the fog, watching, waiting, and then vanished, leaving behind only a torn ticket and the scent of American tobacco. What followed was a descent into secrets long buried, a trail of vengeance, and a final reckoning wrapped in smoke and silence. This is not merely a tale of crime, but of guilt that refused to die. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was upon a bitterly cold evening in early February that I sat once more beside the hearth at 221B Baker Street, the fire casting long shadows across the threadbare carpet and the rain whispering ceaselessly against the window panes. Holmes reclined languidly in his chair, his fingertips pressed together, eyes half-lidded beneath furrowed brows. A posture I had come to recognize as his preferred mode of hibernation when the outside world offered no intellectual sustenance. The lamps flickered with each passing gust, and beyond the glass, the fog rolled thick and yellow over the gaslit street, smothering all beneath its damp shroud. I had been reading a monograph on tropical diseases when Holmes stirred slightly and with an air of detached amusement remarked, "You are uncharacteristically silent, Watson. Has the fog found its way into your thoughts?" Before I could reply, a subtle movement outside the window drew my attention. A shadow shifting amidst the veil of mist, motionless, yet undeniably human. There, just beyond the reach of the lamplight, stood a solitary figure. His posture was erect but uncertain, as though torn between retreat and approach. For several moments he did not stir, his silhouette limned faintly in the fog, as though painted in smoke upon glass. The man's hat was drawn low, obscuring his face, but the glint of water upon his coat told of a recent journey through London's inhospitable streets. I rose halfway from my chair, struck by an inexplicable tension. "Holmes," I said quietly, "there's someone watching us." Holmes did not shift. "Indeed," he replied, "and he has been standing there for precisely 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I turned to him in astonishment, but his gaze remained fixed upon the fire, unmoved by the drama just outside our window. "Observe, Watson," Holmes began in his characteristic tone, cool, precise, and maddeningly assured. "Even from this distance one can deduce a fair amount. His boots are crusted not with ordinary soil, but with fine granules characteristic of maritime docks, likely Dover, judging by the faint scent of salt carried in when you opened the door earlier. His coat is American in cut, broad in the shoulder, tailored without regard to the English season, and his hat, though soaked, bears the faint sheen of a Floridian straw weave, now dyed dark. The way he clutches that umbrella, white-knuckled and trembling, speaks not of chill, but of anxiety, and the way he leans, ever so slightly, on his left side suggests a recent injury, possibly a limp. I found myself staring as ever, in helpless admiration. "But why does he not knock?" "That, Watson," Holmes murmured, "is precisely what concerns me. A man who comes so far and stands so near, yet does not wish to be seen. That is a man with secrets." And as he said it, the figure took one slow step backward into the fog. With a suddenness that startled me, I rushed to the window and flung it open. The cold stung my cheeks at once, and the street below was empty. The watcher had vanished, swallowed by the swirling fog, as if he had never stood there at all. I leaned out, listening, but there was only the faint clatter of distant hooves and the sigh of wind down the alley. When I turned back into the room, Holmes was already on his feet, moving with purpose. "He left something," he said, stooping by the front door. Indeed, a faint damp mark, the imprint of a boot sole, was visible on the stone step. Nearby, as if dropped hastily, lay a cigar half consumed, its end still warm. Beside it, slightly crumpled and slick with moisture, was a steamship ticket. Holmes retrieved it, scanning the print with narrowed eyes. "A single voyage," Holmes murmured, "from Jacksonville to Dover. Yesterday's date." He lifted the cigar, sniffing its end. "Rolled in Tampa, judging by the leaf. A peculiar choice for an English winter." He held both items delicately, then looked up with the faintest glint in his grey eyes. "We are no longer waiting for a case, Watson. It has already arrived, shrouded in fog, wrapped in fear, and tied to the Americas." I felt a chill, not from the weather, but from the silent impression the stranger had left upon our doorstep, a mystery that had come to us unbidden and vanished just as swiftly. The following morning brought with it a change in weather, but no lessening of the mystery. The fog had thinned to a pallid haze, allowing for the dim outlines of hansoms and overcoated pedestrians to re-emerge from the shroud of the night. I had barely settled into my breakfast when Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, whose wiry frame soon appeared in our sitting room, bringing with it a distinct air of unease. He dispensed with pleasantries and drew from his coat a folder of papers tied in string. "Holmes," he began, "I thought this might interest you." Holmes, who had been pacing idly along the hearthrug, took the folder and opened it with deliberate care. 3 sheets of paper, each bearing a few short lines written in a crude, unfamiliar hand, lay inside. At the foot of each was the same unsettling signature, "The 3 Men of Florida." They were all received by Sir Alfred Worsley, the shipping baron, Lestrade said. "He's been in a state these past days. Said he didn't trust the yard to handle it alone." Holmes's eyes moved rapidly over the notes. "Florida, you say?" Lestrade nodded. "He claims it concerns a trial many years past. Something about shipping fraud, but he's not been forthcoming. I'd wager the matter is more personal than he lets on." It was not long before Holmes and I found ourselves bound for Surrey, where Sir Alfred's country estate stood amid a frostbitten stretch of land, sombre and still beneath the overcast sky. The once prosperous magnate, whom I recalled from society columns as robust and self-assured, appeared now a man diminished, gaunt, pallid, and plainly rattled. He received us in a drawing-room whose grandeur could not quite conceal the signs of neglect. Dust gathering upon unused furniture, a fire left to die in its grate, and drapes drawn tight against the daylight. "I told the police all I know," he muttered, his voice brittle and defensive. "These letters are the work of cranks, men with nothing better to do." Holmes seated himself opposite and regarded the man coolly. "Men with nothing better to do rarely sign themselves with geographic precision, nor write with such calculated anonymity. You are afraid, Sir Alfred, and I suspect not merely for your life." Sir Alfred's eyes narrowed, and he gripped the arm of his chair. "You know nothing of what you speak." Holmes gave a faint smile. "On the contrary, I believe I know exactly what has begun to resurface." Holmes requested the original letters, which Sir Alfred reluctantly retrieved from a cabinet drawer, each folded neatly in its envelope and sealed with a now broken crimson wax. As he laid them across the table, Holmes studied each one with the absorption of a man examining the bones of an ancient puzzle. "They are brief," he murmured, "but deliberately so. Each composed on rough paper, likely purchased locally. And yet, here, it begins." He pointed to a peculiar phrasing in the first letter. "You shall meet the judgment we was denied." A grammarian's nightmare, he observed, but common among southern dialects in the American colonies. Holmes moved to the second letter, where the phrase "ain't no forgetting what you done" was underlined twice. This is not a mindless threat, but a studied evocation, designed to rattle the nerves of a man whose conscience has not been entirely at rest. He lifted one of the pages closer to his nose. Curious, he added, a faint but unmistakable scent. I stepped forward, noting the same subtle aroma. Citrus. More precisely, said Holmes, a Floridian oil derived from a bitter orange peel. It is not used in this country, but it lingers like the breath of the past. It took Holmes little time to reach the heart of the matter. Sir Alfred, he said, you know these men. You may not know their names, nor recall their faces, but the shadow they cast now was born years ago, and in America. The baronet sat in silence, his eyes dark beneath heavy brows. You presume much, Holmes leaned forward. I presume only what the letters make plain. Tell us of Jacksonville. Tell us of the trial. There was a pause, brittle, tense, and then the man spoke, the voice low and filled with old gravel. It was nearly 15 years ago. I had business in Florida, overseeing contracts with a firm involved in cotton transport. There was an explosion aboard a vessel, the Belle Ventura, moored in the port at Jacksonville. Half the cargo lost, lives too. He paused, swallowing hard. The American authorities launched an inquiry. I gave testimony. I stated that I had seen the ship's officers tampering with the cargo manifest, removing high-value entries just before the incident. One of the men, I believe his name was Gault, was imprisoned. The others vanished into obscurity. And this Gault? Holmes asked quietly. Sir Alfred looked away. He hanged himself in his cell. The newspapers blame the system. I never read the clippings. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, in a voice neither accusatory nor forgiving, he murmured, Truth has a long shadow, and it walks slowly, but it walks nonetheless. We left the estate in silence, our breath misting in the chill air as the carriage pulled away from the gravel path. Holmes sat with his chin upon his chest, fingers steepled before him, his eyes distant and grey as the afternoon sky. I do not believe, he said at last, that this is a matter of simple vengeance, nor do I believe it is finished. You suspect there is more? I asked. I suspect, he replied, that Sir Alfred's testimony did not merely condemn the guilty, but concealed something far more delicate. The language of those letters is crude, but their intention is precise. These are not idle threats, Watson. They are the call of men who have waited long, suffered quietly, and returned with purpose. And do you fear for Sir Alfred's safety? Holmes gave a slow nod. I fear not merely for his life, but for the truth buried beneath the wreckage of his past. The storm has not yet broken, but its clouds are gathering. And with that, he withdrew once more into silence, his eyes fixed upon the fading countryside, as if seeing something neither present nor wholly gone. The following morning dawned bleak and silent. The Surrey sky hung low with a gauze of slate-coloured cloud. Holmes rose before daybreak and insisted that we return to Sir Alfred's estate without delay. Though the baronet had made no further overture to the police, Holmes's expression, keen, alert, and faintly grim, told me he had already marked the game afoot. We arrived to find the household subdued and the grounds deserted of all activity, save for a solitary gardener trimming the last brittle stems of the winter hedge. Sir Alfred remained cloistered within, claiming fatigue, and delegated one of his servants to escort us about the grounds. Holmes, however, seemed disinclined to make conversation. Instead, he paced the length of the south garden with unbroken concentration, pausing occasionally to kneel and examine the soil with his lens, or press his fingertips against the cold ironwork of the fence. It was near a line of cypress trees at the edge of the garden path that he halted, his gaze fixed intently on a shallow depression in the frost-speckled earth. "Kneel here, Watson," he murmured. Do you perceive it? I complied, squinting into the gravel. A faint mark, heel-shaped, sharp at one end, broke the evenness of the dirt. A footprint? I asked. Holmes nodded. One not made by any of the household nor by the gardener who wears rubber soles. This is the impression of a boot with an American taper, long in the toe, narrow in the waist, and placed precisely where one might linger unseen, facing the house. He stood and turned slowly toward the orchard, now still and veiled in mist. Someone has been watching, and not from a distance. We continued along the garden's outer border until Holmes crouched once more beside a narrow bend in the stone wall. There, nestled in a crevice of brick, lay the faintest trace of something black and crumbling, a smear scarcely longer than a matchstick. Holmes retrieved it with a delicate pinch and held it beneath his lens, inhaling faintly as he examined the residue. A glint of satisfaction flickered in his eyes. "Cigar ash," he said softly, "but not just any. Note the flake. Thin, papery, silver-edged. This is tobacco from the Weibel region, rolled in Tampa. The very same signature as the stub left upon our doorstep in Baker Street." He passed the fragment to me, though I could make little of it. To Holmes, however, it seemed a confirmation most profound. "I do not believe," he continued, "in the coincidence of identical ash appearing at both sites within 2 days. No, Watson, our visitor has travelled swiftly and with purpose." "Then the man we saw, the one in the fog, was no figment nor harmless curiosity," Holmes replied. "He has been here, and judging by the fresh break in this shrub," he gestured to a bent stem nearby, "he was here not long ago." As we made our way back toward the manor, we passed near the orchard, where the bare-limbed trees stood like silent sentinels in the frost. Holmes paused, casting a long gaze across the uneven rows, when a voice called to us from behind. It was the footman, a pale young fellow named Grant, whom I had noticed the day prior, but thought too nervous to be of use. He approached hesitantly, clutching his cap in both hands. "Begging your pardon, sirs," he stammered, "but I saw someone here last night." Holmes turned to him with immediate interest. "When, precisely?" "Just after the lamps were put out, sir, 10:30. I had come out for a bit of air, and I heard something moving amongst the trees." "And what did you see?" Holmes asked, his tone low and steady. "A man, tall, heavy coat, didn't see the face, but he had a limp, clear as day. He moved like his left leg was dragging. Didn't make a sound, neither. Just slipped off into the dark before I dared call out." Holmes glanced at me briefly. "A wounded man, perhaps an old injury, military possibly." He looked back toward the orchard. "The watchers have come close, Watson, closer than even Sir Alfred suspects." That evening, as Holmes and I returned to London by train, he sat in contemplation, one gloved hand resting against his chin, the other gently tapping his cane. It was not until we had reached Baker Street and dined that he spoke again, this time with quiet resolve. "There is one scent, Watson," he said, "that refuses to leave my mind. The citrus oil. It is an affectation of the region, the export of a very specific refinery near Tampa, used in small quantities for letter sealing and perfumed goods. It is not sold in general shops, but there is one place, I believe, that may serve our needs." The next morning, we travelled to a small, nondescript importer, tucked within the commercial alleyways behind King's Cross, a place Holmes had evidently known, but never before visited in my company. The clerk, a spectacled man with thinning hair, confirmed Holmes's suspicion with impressive promptness. "Yes, sir, we do carry it. 3 recent purchases, in fact, of our Floridian orange sealant. Rather rare, that one." Holmes leaned forward. "Names?" The clerk checked a small register. "Mr. Miller, Mr. Gaines, and Mr. Thorne." "All recent?" Holmes inquired. Within the past fortnight. Holmes turned to me as we exited, his voice low. All aliases, undoubtedly, but all American, and all preparing something long in motion. He pulled his collar up against the cold wind. We must speak to Lestrade. I want ship manifests. 3 men have arrived, Watson, and this is only the beginning. Holmes's gaze lingered on the names in the shop ledger, his finger resting just beneath the final entry. Observe the spacing, he murmured. These are not the scrawls of casual purchases. Each hand is deliberate, though altered. I peered over his shoulder. Thorne, Gaines, and Miller, all common, unremarkable names. Precisely, said Holmes. Their ordinariness is their disguise. But look here. He pointed to a slight flourish in the capital T of Thorne, a backward sweep not typical of the British hand. An affectation more common in the southern states, particularly among men educated before the war. He turned to the clerk once more. Did any of these gentlemen speak much? The man scratched his chin. The one who signed as Mr. Gaines. Yes. Spoke in a slow drawl, sir. Used the term reckon a great deal. Not much of a gentleman, if you take my meaning. Holmes gave a curt nod. That accent is not affected. One does not mimic regional dialect without years of habit. These men are not mere visitors to our shores, Watson. They have returned with purpose. He paused at the door, casting a glance back at the shopkeeper. If any of them should return, I ask only that you delay them by any means at hand and inform Scotland Yard at once. And with that, we stepped once more into the bracing wind, the faint scent of citrus still clinging to Holmes's gloves. Later that afternoon, by appointment at Scotland Yard, Inspector Lestrade ushered us into a cramped office where a stack of passenger ledgers from the Port Authority awaited Holmes's scrutiny. With characteristic precision, Holmes set about turning page after page, his finger trailing names until it halted midway through the 3rd log. Here, he said, the SS Clementine from Jacksonville, Florida, arrived 3 weeks ago. Lestrade leaned in. Plenty of passengers aboard. Any names that match your Floridian trio? Holmes tapped the entries. 1 Edward Gaines travelling alone, 1 Michael Thorne, listed as a merchant, and 1 Samuel Miller, occupation given as clerk. All arriving under separate bookings, each spaced 2 pages apart, a clear attempt to avoid immediate association. Watson added, and all 3 names match those recorded at the importers. Indeed, Holmes said, their arrival aligns precisely with the delivery of the first threat to Sir Alfred. It would appear they came not to renew old acquaintance, but to stir old embers into flame. Lestrade frowned. Should we arrest them? Holmes shook his head. For what crime, Inspector? A name written in ink and a note scented with oil? No. We must wait. They have made one move, then another. The 3rd is inevitable. He closed the ledger softly. And when it comes, I intend to be listening. We had scarcely returned to Baker Street when a telegram awaited us on the table, its envelope marked in the familiar angular hand of Sir Alfred's footman. Holmes read it once and passed it silently to me. The message was brief. Another letter came this morning. Same signature. This one reads, "The 2nd man has arrived." The words were few, but their implication rang loud in Holmes's expression. Calm, but cold. The game accelerates, he said. They are announcing their progress, not merely threatening, but staging. I stared at the telegram. Why announce it at all? Holmes's gaze sharpened. Because they want him to suffer, slowly, deliberately. This is not vengeance in haste. It is vengeance rehearsed. He stood and moved toward the fireplace, retrieving the folded passenger manifest from his coat. 2 have arrived. 1 remains. and they want Sir Alfred to feel the steps drawing nearer with each breath. He tucked the telegram into the edge of the mantle, letting it rest like a warning above the flames. "We must go back to Worsley Hall, Watson," he said. "This is no longer the mere echo of a past injustice. The storm has touched the ground." It was a grim and sunless morning when we returned to Worsley Hall, the sky low with cloud and the trees shivering faintly in the wind. Holmes had spoken little during our journey, but his silence was not one of idleness. I recognized in his distant gaze a mind already chasing shadows before they could become substance. As we arrived, the estate was in uproar. A constable's bicycle lay against the gatepost, and a stable boy, pale as milk, was being consoled by the cook on the steps. Sir Alfred met us in the foyer, his usual veneer of pride wholly replaced by a tremulous agitation. "They've found a body, Holmes," he said in a hoarse whisper, "near the trees by the south wood." The dead man was a servant, a junior undergardener named Finlay, scarcely more than 20 years of age. His lifeless form lay amid the frostbitten underbrush, his scarf twisted grotesquely about his neck. Holmes knelt beside him with calm precision, his eyes scanning not only the body, but the scene, the drag marks in the soil, the scuffed bootprints nearby, and most notably, the object clutched in the youth's frozen hand. It was a torn envelope, badly crumpled and damp, but still bearing a name. Gort. Holmes turned it over slowly, then glanced toward the woods beyond. "He was trying to deliver something," he murmured, "and someone meant to ensure he did not." Then, rising with sudden resolve, he added, "This was no random act. It was a message, meant not for us, but for one of their own." Back within the drawing room, Holmes examined the envelope once more beneath the glow of the morning fire. The ink had run in the damp, but the hand that had addressed it remained legible enough, neat, compressed, and unmistakably English. A contrast, he observed, to the clumsy scrawl of the threatening letters. "I believe," he said, "that this envelope was not penned by our Floridian visitors, but by someone within this household. Perhaps even the victim himself. And the name upon it, Galt." I frowned. But Galt was the man imprisoned in Florida, the one who took his own life. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely, and yet here, his name re-emerges, not in accusation, but in address. What does it signify? I said nothing, for I could offer no answer. Holmes stood and walked to the window, watching the trees sway against the grey sky. "Consider the possibility," he continued, "that Galt is not the ghost we imagined, but a symbol, a name carried forward by another, a message to the conspirators perhaps, or a betrayal among them." He turned toward me. "In either case, Watson, it proves one thing with certainty. And what is that? That they are not united." With the name Galt reverberating in our thoughts, Holmes pursued a quiet line of inquiry that same afternoon, one which led us back to London and into a narrow terrace street in South Kensington. It was there, in a modest boarding house run by a widow of precise speech and excellent memory, that Holmes believed one of the conspirators had taken temporary lodging. "He came a week ago," the woman told us, "introduced himself as Mr. Edwin Finch, said he was a birdwatcher from Georgia, America that is. Quiet fellow, but always watching the street from the upper window." At Holmes's request, she led us up the stairs to the rented room. The door was ajar. Within, we found an open case, several ornithology books stacked beside it, and a pair of high boots stained with recent soil. But of the man, there was no sign. "Still warm," Holmes muttered, his hand on the teapot. "He's fled." A cry from the stairwell confirmed it. The landlady, startled, pointed down the alley as a dark figure dashed through the garden gate. Without hesitation, Holmes and I gave chase, but the man was swift and familiar with the terrain. We followed through alleys and past carts, but he vanished into the smoke of the city. Holmes stopped at last, breath calm but his eyes glinting. "He has fled," he said, which tells me more than if he had stayed. As we had given chase, I had managed, for one fleeting instant, to glimpse our quarry as he darted past a street lamp. His collar had flared, and beneath it, on the left side of his neck, I had seen something inked into the flesh. A faded mark, but one unmistakable in my trained eye. "A tattoo, Holmes," I said, as we paused for breath. "On his neck, a military crest. Cavalry, by the look of it." Holmes turned to me sharply. "Did you note the insignia?" I could not see the full detail, but it bore crossed sabres and the number 13. Holmes's face grew still. The 13th U.S. Cavalry. They served in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, a brutal campaign, and one that bred more resentment than medals. "So our birdwatcher was no idle naturalist," I said grimly. "No," Holmes agreed. "He was a soldier, and perhaps more than that, one bound to Galt by something far deeper than vengeance." He glanced at the streets behind us, now swallowed by fog. "The war left its mark, Watson. On the skin, yes, but also on the soul." That evening, as we dined once more at Worsley Hall, the calm was shattered by a shriek from the courtyard. A servant burst into the dining room, face flushed and eyes wild. "The carriage house!" he cried. "It's aflame!" Holmes and I followed the others at a run. Already the outbuilding was engulfed in smoke, the dry timber crackling beneath the blaze. Men ran with buckets, shouting orders, but it was clear the fire had taken firm hold before discovery. When at last the flames were subdued and the blackened air gave way to char and ash, Holmes stepped inside with deliberate caution. He called for a lamp, and I followed close behind. Against the far wall, scorched but still legible through the soot, was a message, carved crudely into the wooden beam. "We are here. One remains." Holmes stared at the words in silence. The heat from the embers glowed on his face, casting strange shadows across his features. "It is no longer mere theatre," he said at last. "They have declared their presence." "And the fire?" I asked. "A warning," Holmes replied. "Or perhaps a curtain to obscure something else." He turned slowly toward the broken shelves at the back of the structure, his expression unreadable. "This," he said, "was not an end, but a signal." It was just before dawn when a frantic knock at our Baker Street lodgings roused Holmes and myself from uneasy slumber. A stable lad, breathless and red-faced, stood on the step with a crumpled note in hand. Holmes read it once and sprang into action. "Sir Alfred Worsley has disappeared," he said curtly, donning his greatcoat. "His study was found in disarray. The matter admits no delay." The hansom made quick work of the journey, and by mid-morning we arrived once more at Worsley Hall, now shrouded in a silence more ominous than any we had yet encountered. The household staff moved like wraiths through the corridors. Sir Alfred's valet, pale and shaking, led us at once to the study. It was a scene of turmoil. The heavy oak desk had been overturned, its drawers gaping open like dislocated jaws. One of the lamps lay shattered on the floor. The fire had burned itself low, casting little warmth in the room now tinged with a stale and smoky scent. The window pane was cracked, and beneath it, scattered like breadcrumbs, lay fragments of broken glass and a torn scrap of velvet curtain. "There was a struggle," Holmes said quietly, kneeling to examine the carpet, "but no blood." I surveyed the room. Could he have gone willingly? Holmes shook his head. "No man walks out of his own study at night, abandoning both coat and hat unless he is compelled." He moved his lens slowly across the floor. "We are no longer dealing with threats, Watson. We are now firmly in the realm of action." Holmes had begun his systematic study of the room, moving as though through a sacred rite, touching nothing until he had first looked, then smelled. and only then, lightly, precisely, handled each object. Near the window, he halted. He knelt beside the cracked floorboard, where a narrow gap ran along the base of the bookshelf. There, nestled in the dust, was a small object, a brass cufflink, dull from age but unmistakably adorned with a single engraved letter. M. Holmes held it to the light, with the care of a jeweller examining a flawed emerald. "A sailor's cufflink," he murmured. "Heavy, brassed, the kind worn as part of a uniform. Functional, not decorative." He turned it in his palm. "Note the engraving. Not an initial for fashion, but for identification. These were often issued in pairs by captains for officers of standing. And this one belongs to a man I had rather hoped was long since buried beneath the waves." His expression darkened. "Micah Thorne," he said. I felt the name strike the air like a chill. Holmes wasted no time. Within the hour, we were back in London, and he had requested from Lestrade all known maritime records on Captain Micah Thorne, a name which, even to the hardened inspector, carried weight. Thorne, as Holmes explained on our journey, had once served as first officer aboard a merchant vessel known as the Belle Ventura, a ship of ill repute among transatlantic circles. She had disappeared under mysterious circumstances off the Gulf Coast of Florida, her cargo lost, her crew presumed drowned, save for 3 men who miraculously survived and later vanished into obscurity. And among them, Holmes said gravely, was Thorne. Lestrade's files painted the picture of a volatile man, decorated for courage, but twice court-martialed for insubordination and finally discharged with disgrace. Rumours abounded of his involvement in illegal shipping contracts, extortion and smuggling. All rumours silenced after the Belle Ventura went down. Sir Alfred, Holmes said, gave damning testimony in the matter of that vessel. His statements in a Jacksonville court ensured that Galt, the American shipowner, was imprisoned, and that Thorne's associates were left to scatter, ruined. I looked up. "Then Thorne has returned not for justice, but for vengeance." Holmes nodded. "Revenge plotted across an ocean, Watson, is the coldest kind and the slowest." By the firelight of Baker Street that evening, Holmes laid out the tattered ghost of a tale, the tragedy of the Belle Ventura, now risen from the sea. "She was not," he began, "a vessel of fortune. The Belle Ventura carried sugar, oranges, and freight between Tampa and London. But in her final voyage, she carried something far more volatile: resentment, forged by betrayal." Holmes produced a chart marked with shipping routes. According to this, 3 men survived her sinking: Thorne, Gaines, and Miller. The same names, you'll note, that purchased Florida oil in London. Survivors, yes, but not witnesses. "They were the crew?" I asked. Holmes inclined his head. "The last of them. The owners blamed Alfred Worsley's testimony for the collapse of their enterprise, and in turn for the death of E. Galt, once a man of influence, reduced to disgrace." "But why wait?" I pressed. "Why now, after so many years?" "Because vengeance matures like whiskey, Watson," Holmes said. "It takes time. These men have waited, watched, and moved in silence until all were in place." He stood, facing the street. "And now their ghosts walk again. Not for truth, but for reckoning." It was I who uncovered the final thread. Driven by Holmes's allusions to the name on the torn envelope, I undertook my own inquiry. I travelled alone to the legal archives of the Old Bailey, and from there, with the help of a sympathetic clerk, unearthed the prison records of one Elias Galt, merchant, shipowner, and once betrothed to Miss Clara Worsley, Sir Alfred's younger sister. The story was a pitiful one. Galt, indicted for fraudulent shipping claims in Florida, had pleaded innocence, asserting he was framed by falsified logs and misdirected manifests. Yet it was Sir Alfred's testimony cool, irrefutable, and damning, that sealed his fate. He was sentenced to 5 years. 3 months later, he was found dead in his cell, suicide by hanging. What chilled me most, however, was the brief letter recovered from his body, addressed but never sent. It read only, "Clara, I did what I could to protect us. Tell your brother nothing. He will not understand. Forgive me. Elias." When I returned to Baker Street and shared what I had found, Holmes listened in silence. "So," I said, "Worsley condemned the man who would have become his brother-in-law." "Perhaps knowingly," Holmes replied. "Perhaps not. But in doing so, he shattered more than a partnership. He buried a family shame." He glanced at the torn envelope once more. "And now that shame has clawed its way to the surface, clothed in fire and ash." It was late in the evening when Holmes, seated cross-legged before the hearth with his fingers steepled and his gaze fixed upon the dancing flames, spoke at last after a long silence. "They will strike again, Watson. Of that there is no doubt." I looked up from the notes I had been reviewing. "You believe the culmination is near." "Not merely near, calculated," he replied. "A reckoning of this kind is not random in its finale. Each act thus far has escalated with theatrical precision: message, murder, fire. There remains but one thread to pull: the man himself." "Sir Alfred?" Holmes nodded slowly. "The final blow must be public, symbolic, a moment of great personal weight." He stood and paced slowly to the mantel. "His brother's memorial is to be held in 2 days' time, a sacred observance, intimate and steeped in remembrance. It is the one place where Alfred will let his guard down entirely, where past and present converge." There was a certain gravity in Holmes's voice that I had seldom heard. It was not fear, for he knew no such thing, but inevitability. "And if I were a man burning with vengeance," he murmured, "I would choose the altar for my dagger." The following morning, Holmes dispatched me on an errand most peculiar. "Send a telegram to Worsley Hall from the office nearest Scotland Yard," he instructed. "State that the memorial has been postponed due to illness. Let it appear official." I obeyed without question, though my mind was filled with them. "Upon my return," Holmes clarified, "the message is false, of course, but it is designed to limit the audience. Only those with inside knowledge, and those monitoring Sir Alfred closely, will know the truth." "Then the ceremony will proceed?" "Precisely," he replied, "but with a markedly selective congregation." He leaned in, his eyes sharp. "The killer must believe his prey will not be there. That belief will permit him to lower his own veil, and that, my dear Watson, is where we shall wait." The morning of the memorial dawned bleak and overcast, a fitting backdrop for the sombre occasion. Holmes had vanished early, taking with him a modest black case and offering no explanation beyond a terse instruction that Lestrade and I should be seated in the second pew to the left of the aisle. We arrived at Worsley Chapel shortly before the hour. The building was small, stone-built and ivy-clad, nestled within the estate's wooded boundary. A thin mist clung to the grass, and the bell tolled in solemn cadence. Within, a modest assembly had gathered, no more than a dozen mourners, most of them family or trusted household staff. There was no sign of Sir Alfred. I took my seat beside Lestrade, who kept one hand inside his coat at all times. It was then that the vicar entered, or rather, a man robed as such, his face pale and long, his beard trimmed and silvering. There was, however, a peculiar stiffness to his gait, and though he bore a book of psalms in hand, his eyes flicked sharply across each face in the congregation, with a scrutiny that betrayed the habit of detection, not devotion. It was Holmes, of course. He began the service in hushed, deliberate tones, each word imbued with careful rhythm. All was still. All was watching. And yet, Beneath the chapel's calm, there coiled a waiting serpent, one Holmes had baited with holy silence. It was during the reading of the 23rd Psalm, Holmes's voice slow and deliberate, that the intruder made his move. A man in mourning black rose quietly from the rear pew. His head was bowed, hands gloved, and his step reverent. To the casual eye, he might have been merely a grief-stricken guest approaching the altar in prayer. But I saw the change in Holmes's bearing, subtle though it was. A tightening of the shoulders, a fractional turn of the wrist that closed the prayer book. The man drew closer. From his coat he produced what first seemed a folded handkerchief. And then, with the motion of a conjurer, it became something gleaming. A blade. Gasps rose from the front pews. The man, now unveiled, raised the dagger high, his voice a hoarse whisper. "For the Belle Ventura!" He never finished the sentence. In that moment, the vicar vanished, and Holmes stood in his place. With a swiftness that belied his disguise, Holmes stepped forward and seized the attacker's wrist before the blade could descend. There was no struggle, only a single sharp twist that sent the weapon clattering to the stone floor, where Lestrade's boots were already in motion. The mourners cried out, some rising, others frozen. I was at Holmes's side in an instant, but found I was not needed. Captain Micah Thorne, for such he was, sagged in Holmes's grip like a marionette cut from its strings. The fury had fled him. What remained was ruin. Lestrade secured him, and Holmes released his hold with surgical calm. "I expected more ceremony," Holmes said softly, his tone dry. "But I suppose you Americans are admirers of efficiency." Thorne said nothing. His eyes darted not toward his captors, but toward the altar, as if some final absolution still awaited him there. The chapel returned slowly to order. The dagger was retrieved. The mourners led out. Only Holmes remained at the front, staring for a long while at the hymn book resting upon the pulpit. "It is curious," he said to me at last, "how vengeance chooses its stage, and how often it mistakes silence for weakness." The chapel was still in the wake of chaos, the final echoes of gasps and footsteps swallowed by the ancient stones. Lestrade moved briskly, with the calm force of a man well versed in sudden violence. Two constables, previously hidden at the rear of the nave, appeared and flanked Captain Micah Thorne. The former sailor did not resist. He stood ramrod straight, his hands raised as if still delivering orders upon a windlashed deck. His morning coat had slipped from one shoulder, revealing a glimpse of the weathered uniform beneath. Holmes had discarded his clerical vestments and now stood tall and spare before the altar. He removed the false beard and spectacles with slow deliberation, exposing not only his true face, but the precise intellect that had trapped its prey in solemn stillness. Not a word passed between them. Sir Alfred, pale and shaken, remained seated near the front pew. His eyes never met Thorne's. Lestrade, with a brisk nod, signalled the removal. As Thorne was led down the aisle between pews of staring mourners, I caught Holmes's eye. He gave the slightest incline of the head. Not triumph, but closure. The game was nearly done, but not yet complete. We reconvened in the vestry adjoining the chapel, a sombre room panelled in dark oak and filled with the scent of candle wax and age. There, in the presence of Holmes, Lestrade and myself, Captain Micah Thorne sat at the small writing desk, wrists manacled, gaze steady. He spoke before any of us could. "I do not deny it," he said, "nor do I beg pardon. A man carries his dead, and sooner or later the burden drives him to speak." His voice bore no trembling. It was as if he had waited years to unseal the words. "The Belle Ventura was doomed before she left harbour," he continued. "The owners, Galt among them, cut corners to keep her afloat. Rotten planking, unpaid crew, forged cargo manifests. When the storm came, she might have held, had she been honest. He paused. But Galt, he sought to make her wreck his fortune, an insurance claim, and so we sailed her into death. Holmes said nothing. Thorne's eyes turned to us, not with fury, but indictment. 3 of us lived. Gaines died coughing blood in a Portsmouth alley. Miller jumped from the tower at Clerkenwell. I remained. And Worsley? I asked. He testified, Thorne replied. With precision. He told the truth, or just enough of it, enough to send Galt to prison, enough to bury the scandal, and with it, our names. His jaw tightened. I did not seek vengeance, Doctor. I sought acknowledgement, a word upon a headstone. I saw now the tragedy laid bare, a man not mad, but stranded in memory, where the tide had never turned. It was the silence after his confession that struck me most, a stillness heavy with that peculiar air found only after truths too long withheld. Thorne lowered his head into his shackled hands, not in shame, but fatigue. The years, I thought, had lived long inside him. You must think me a madman, he muttered, but I swore I would not let them be forgotten. Not Gaines, who gave me his only blanket as fever took him. Not Miller, who whispered hymns while we waited for the rescue boat that never came. He looked up then, and the tears in his eyes did not shimmer with guilt, but with the aching burden of memory. The world moved on, he said softly. But we remained, ghosts in a logbook no one read. When I heard Worsley was being honoured, speeches, flowers, marble, I could bear it no longer. Holmes stepped forward slightly but said nothing. Thorne's voice was hoarse. Had he ever said one word? That we existed? That we died in silence while he prospered in his truth? There was no rage in him now. Only a deep, exhausted sorrow that filled the room like the scent of smoke after a fire. As Lestrade gave the order to remove the prisoner, I observed Holmes with a care honed from long acquaintance. He remained composed, arms folded, gaze fixed upon the retreating figure of Captain Thorne. Yet in that otherwise impassive expression, I perceived something fleeting, a glimmer, scarcely more than a twitch at the corner of his eye. Not pity, certainly not sentimentality, but something adjacent to understanding. Holmes had often remarked that the motives which drive men to crime are rarely simple, and in Thorne I saw a man for whom justice and remembrance had become indistinguishable. When the door closed behind the constables, Holmes exhaled slowly. A man may commit a crime, he said, not to destroy, but to remember. And with that, he turned, gathering his coat in one fluid motion. The chapel bell began once more to toll, not for the dead this time, but perhaps for the forgotten. The following evening found us once more in the quiet haven of Baker Street, the weariness of recent events softened by the familiar crackle of the fire and the rhythmic tick of the mantel clock. Outside, a thin drizzle fell across the rooftops, casting the lamplight in tremulous halos upon the panes. Holmes sat opposite me, ensconced in his armchair, the fingers of his right hand curled about the stem of his meerschaum pipe. His gaze was unfocused, not idle, but deep within the corridors of reflection. I confess, Holmes, I began, I still fail to grasp how you anticipated so much. From a crumpled ticket and a burnt cigar to a murderous climax beneath the chapel arch. He exhaled a thin plume of smoke. It was all there from the beginning, Watson, he said quietly. The scent, the ash, the silence. Each a voice, if one knows how to listen. He leaned forward, the glint returning to his eyes. Shall I recount it? The cigar, Holmes began, was the first to speak. A rare blend, rolled not in Havana, but in the southern reaches of Florida, where the wrapper bears a distinctive dryness. When our silent visitor departed from Baker Street that night, he left more than a footprint. He left identity burned down to its stub. I recalled the object, mottled and pungent, tucked within a fold of the man's discarded ticket. Then there was the citrus, Holmes continued. That faint but unmistakable aroma on the edges of the threatening letters. Not the common scent of English orange, but sharper. Floridian. The oil of the key lime, to be precise. Imported only through a handful of niche merchants in London. He reached for the coal scuttle with languid precision. With these two threads, ash and oil, the scent trail led naturally to a point of origin. The handwriting bore American irregularities, the phrasing, a southern dialect. Holmes tapped the bowl of his pipe gently, and so I saw the shadows of 3 men from a sunken place. Not criminals, but phantoms with purpose. And purpose, Watson, always has a scent. He paused then, and I knew he was only just beginning. I next turned to records, Holmes resumed. For while vengeance is cloaked in silence, travel leaves its own litter. He stood and retrieved a small folder from the mantelpiece drawer, which he opened to reveal several slips of paper, dock receipts, sales ledgers, and immigration logs. 3 separate purchases at the citrus shop, all under American aliases. One name, J. Booker, used in Jacksonville insurance trials years ago. Another, Mr. C. Pierce, signed at a London boarding house, matched a man who bore a limp and a military tattoo. He laid the ship's manifest on the table. The SS Clementine docked in Tilbury 3 weeks before the first letter arrived. On board, 3 men from Jacksonville, Florida. Their claimed professions, merchant, tutor, missionary, were transparent nonsense. I studied the list. The names were unfamiliar, but the implications were stark. It was not the names themselves, Holmes said, but their coordinated timing, the echo of the letters, the American spelling, and the trail of oil. Each detail alone was smoke. Together, they became fire. He looked at me. 3 men walked ashore. Each left a thread, and I pulled them. It was never about a single strike, Holmes continued, but about erosion, the steady crumbling of a man's composure under calculated pressure. He paced now, slow and deliberate. Thorne, I believe, understood Sir Alfred Worsley better than the man understood himself. He gauged him not as a target of violence, but of memory. The letters, blunt yet personal, were only the first wave. I nodded slowly. And the servant? Holmes's brow darkened. Collateral. A message embedded in tragedy. The man likely intercepted correspondence intended for the conspirators. An envelope addressed to Galt, the ghost of the affair. Thorne could not risk exposure, so he removed the witness. His voice dropped. The fire was pure theatre, a flourish. It forced Sir Alfred into retreat, broke his rhythm, made him grasp at safety. And then came the final stage, the altar, a place of forgiveness, yet chosen for judgment. Holmes turned toward the fire again. It was not madness, it was design. Each piece moved with intention, each note sharpened by grief. Thorne sought not bloodshed, but collapse, the collapse of the image Sir Alfred had preserved. He said nothing more, and in the silence, I felt the cold edge of precision. And what of Sir Alfred's guilt? I asked at last. Holmes's gaze lingered on the coals, then slowly turned to me. He altered testimony, yes, but not for profit. He did so to erase Galt's name from the affair. I frowned. Why? Holmes drew a breath. Because Galt was once engaged to his sister. Her name would have been dragged through the mud alongside his. Sir Alfred chose ruin for Galt over disgrace for her. He lifted the cigar stub again. It was, in its own way, an honourable deceit, though one that reaped its own harvest in silence. I leaned back, the weight of the story settling in my chest. So he buried the truth. Holmes replied, "Yes, but truth buried is not truth dead, and those who sleep beneath injustice seldom remain quiet forever." The case, though closed in all tangible respects, left behind an echo that seemed to linger in the corners of our Baker Street sitting room, like the scent of old tobacco smoke. The fire had settled into a gentle smoulder, casting a copper hue across Holmes's sharp features as he reclined with his long legs stretched toward the hearth, his hands steepled beneath his chin. We had spoken little since our return. Holmes had given his formal statement to Lestrade, and Sir Alfred Worsley, now freed from immediate danger, had withdrawn into the secluded refuge of his estate. But the true resolution, I sensed, was not to be found in law or headlines, but in the quieter chambers of the human conscience. Holmes had not moved for some time, save for the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. I knew better than to interrupt such spells of silent contemplation. His mind, though calm in outward bearing, often worked most feverishly in the moments following a solution, not upon matters of logic, but on something subtler and infinitely more burdensome. He stirred at last, and I knew that whatever thoughts had taken root would now find their voice, not in excitement but in philosophy. "It is an odd thing, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "how a single utterance, no louder than a courtroom sentence, may unleash years of consequence." I turned toward him, noting that he had lit one of the Florida cigars, more for meditation than pleasure. The smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling. "Sir Alfred's testimony," he continued, "was not a lie in the strictest sense. It was a mission shaped into safety. He spared his sister's name, but in doing so, condemned Galt. That, in turn, hardened the hearts of 3 men into instruments of retribution." He tapped the ash gently into a tray. "The Belventura may have sunk by sea water, but it was scuttled by silence and made heavy by a cargo of wounded honour." The words lingered between us, not accusingly, but with the dispassionate clarity of a surgeon examining an old scar. "Truth, when bent toward convenience," Holmes said, "becomes a blade. And like all blades, it cannot choose what it cuts." I made no reply, for in that moment I too saw not just a chain of deduction, but a trail of sorrow, born not of evil intent, but of frailty, secrecy, and human care. Holmes turned his gaze toward the dying fire, and though his expression remained composed, his voice held the quiet gravity of moral reckoning. "There is a curious potency in silence, Watson," he said. "It cloaks shame with the illusion of honour, binds guilt beneath civility, and allows grief to ferment into vengeance." I had seen this before in Holmes, a rare moment in which his brilliance bent not toward the crime, but the cost. "Thorne was not seeking blood," he went on, "but remembrance. He and his fellows were not forgotten by accident, but buried by deliberate omission. When men feel erased, they do not simply vanish. They wait, and when the weight of that silence grows too great, it returns as thunder." He drew on the cigar once more, and I watched as the ember flared against the dusk. "It is no great challenge to apprehend a criminal, but to understand the sorrow that made him, that is the true art of our profession." I nodded slowly. For all his logic, it was in moments such as this that Holmes revealed the steel edge of his compassion, not soft, but deeply forged in clarity. Outside, the evening had grown dense with fog, and the gaslights along Baker Street stood as wan sentinels in the gloom. Holmes rose, the cigar between his fingers burning low, and approached the window with that slow, deliberate gait I had come to associate with his most reflective moods. He drew back the curtain slightly and peered into the murk. "One man's testimony can sink a ship," he murmured. but it is the silence afterward that truly drowns a man. The words hung in the room, as still as the fog beyond the glass. I joined him at the window, my own thoughts adrift in the eddies of memory. The faces of the 3 Floridian seamen, etched with bitterness and sorrow, passed through my mind. So too did the strained, haunted eyes of Sir Alfred, who had chosen shame over scandal and paid for it in shadows. Holmes took one final draw from the cigar and extinguished it without ceremony. "In the end," I said quietly, "perhaps it is not the guilty who suffer most, but those who bury guilt in the name of protection." Holmes gave a single nod, and together we watched the fog thicken, silent, unjudging, eternal. As we sat once more by the fire at Baker Street, the thick London fog brushing against the window panes, Holmes remained unusually quiet. At last he spoke, not with triumph, but with the gravity that only truth can summon. "Justice, Watson," he said, "is rarely blind. It sees, but sometimes too late. After the man is broken, the name is ruined. The silence has already done its work. A single lie may crack a reputation, but silence rots it from within." He reached for the cigar, the same brand found by the window weeks ago, and lit it slowly. "What haunts me," he added softly, "is not that Thorne sought vengeance, but that he believed no one else ever would." What do you think truly condemned Sir Alfred? The lies he told, or the truths he hid? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed unravelling this mystery, be sure to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes investigations, and share this story with fellow lovers of classic detective fiction.